Good afternoon. Today is Monday, the 13th of May, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host today, but I'm delighted to say I've got Charles Malet with me in the studio. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Brian.
To a very, very wet Plymouth, I must say, but we had a glorious weekend, so I think we'll just have to put up with the rain for the next couple of days. We've also got Mark Anderson with us from the States, and we're hoping very much to have Diane, Rasmussen, McAdie on with us to give a little report. She had an interview with Scottish TV this morning, but we're not sure whether she's able to join us or not, so we'll see when the time comes. Well, we're going to kick off with matters to do with Ukraine, and Charles, amazing things happening over the last couple of the days because the Russians have opened up a new front in the Kharkiv direction. Whether this is to produce a buffer zone to stop the repeated attacks on the Belgorod area, or it is the start of a bigger campaign into the northern region of Ukraine, I'm not sure. But what is interesting is how things are being reported across the board by Ministry of Defence in UK.
That's it, Brian. Good afternoon, all. Yes, so what we'll do is have a look at the intelligence picture, or at least the way that the Ministry of Defence is casting the intelligence picture. So they put out regular updates from Defence Intelligence. And as a sort of small case study, we'll just look at the update from today, in which they concentrate on Russia's use of light vehicles. Effectively, the inference the reader is supposed to draw is that there aren't enough armoured vehicles left, and therefore that the Russians have had to resort to desperate measures, and that the Ukrainian FPV drones have already demonstrated their ability to effectively target such light vehicles. So the question is this really intelligence, or is it something else? Something else that forms part of the information war? And we'll look further at the intelligence update from the 10th of May, in which they report on the Russian Victory Day parade. And again, the question is this really intelligence? They talk about 61 military vehicles on display. There was an absence of heavy armoured vehicles or tracked military vehicles. The lone ceremonial Second World War era T-34 tank starting the parade was the sole main battle tank present. This contrasts with the 2020 Moscow parade, which included 20 main battle tanks. Well, I'm sure anyone who's been following any form of news, but particularly the UK column, will have a fairly good idea as to why 20 main battle tanks might not have been deployed on such a parade. But of course, the Defence Intelligence are saying that the significant losses of Russian personnel and equipment as a result of the Ukraine war, there was no opportunity for Russia to use the parades to demonstrate military strength. Again, I would question as to whether that is intelligence. Further, we look at the battlefield situation, or at least how it's being cast. And is this really objective intelligence? Specifically, the little parts that identify Crimea, in which we're told that it's Ukrainian territory annexed by force by Russia in 2014. And indeed, the Donbass is referred to being Ukraine territory under de facto control of Russia since 2014. Which begs the question, what is defence intelligence? What is it for, and who controls it? The government website states that it's part of Strategic Command. Defence intelligence empowers decision makers in the Ministry of Defence by providing intelligence products and assessment. Well, the language used there, empowering decision makers, but to do what and with what? Critically, oversight. Now, they say that intelligence activity must be subject to external scrutiny. Now, I would agree, this is absolutely critical. And they go on to talk about the Investigatory Powers Commissioner inspecting defence intelligence records. So they set out the case as to how things should actually work. But let's look back to the annual report from the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament from 2022-2023, and in particular the statement given by the chair, Sir Julian Lewis, explaining what the intelligence community is and therefore where defence intelligence sort of sits within that. But particularly he concentrates on the current lack of oversight of those parts of other policy departments engaged in security and intelligence activities, and the impact on the assurances that can currently be provided to Parliament and the public regarding those activities is a matter of serious concern. he goes on and talks about the government failing to update the committee's remit to include those parts of policy departments to which intelligence and security responsibilities have been devolved, and says it is deeply disappointing that effective scrutiny of national security issues is being prevented in direct contravention of commitments given to Parliament. So the question whether the government has really thought through the consequences of its current position. Further, he goes on to talk about the oversight being frustrated and describes that it therefore cannot provide any assurance to the public or Parliament that the intelligence agencies are acting appropriately. So this is fairly damning, and he wraps up by saying the National Security Advisor himself acknowledged the intelligence community's license to operate is dependent upon credible oversight. So it looks really like what Defence Intelligence are producing, and indeed the sort of the lack of scrutiny, is creating a huge amount of very political bias. Not just that, but also it allows a narrative, a creeping narrative involving conscription and fear and indeed the idea of war with Russia to creep in. And I would illustrate that with the slide that the British Army have up at the moment, talking about steadfast defender, which I've shown before. And I think it's almost impossible to interpret an illustration like this without thinking that in some way we are already at war with Russia. And further, just to sort of square the circle, we look at Chatham House publishing this just last week, a piece called "The UK should not rule out sending troops to Ukraine despite Putin's nuclear threats." And there's a picture of David Cameron, who of course was reported on just last week as having said some fairly extraordinary things about the use of the weapons that Ukraine was being sent by the UK, which Brian spoke about on Friday. Cameron specifically said without caveats, and indeed effectively washed his hands of whatever might happen to British munitions once they've left for Ukraine. And he said that their decision about how to use these weapons is entirely their affair. So the part that Defence Intelligence seems to be playing in all of this is highly questionable, and indeed it's really very hard to look at it as a straight intelligence product. Brian, I'm sure you've got a comment to make on exactly the way that things are looking.
Well, my comment, particularly on the tweets being put out by Defence Intelligence, is how unbelievably childish they are to try and suggest that Russia's so short of tanks it couldn't put them at the parade is just utter nonsense. But there can only be one thing going on, and that is that Defence Intelligence is attempting to mislead the British public as to what's really happening. And this is misinformation and it's disinformation. And as such, to me, it forms propaganda to give the public mind a different opinion than reality as to what's actually happening in Ukraine. So I think this is pretty shocking, and a lack of oversight being stated. There's some serious questions need to be asked. Okay, well, if that's what's happening overseas, my attention was focused rapidly over the weekend by a number of people saying, have you seen this document? Which indeed I hadn't. It's called the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, Conspiracy Theories, a Guide for Members of Parliament and Candidates. Now, when you see these documents, it's always good to have a look at who's involved. I'll come back to these particular organisations in just a moment. But it says here, special thanks to Dr. Matthew Sweet for advising on this guide, and I'll come back to him in a minute. But if you go looking a little bit for this document, a Guardian article pops up pretty quickly. What conspiracy theories are UK MPs being told to look out for? MPs and election candidates are being given a guide about conspiracy theories covering topics such as 5G and the climate crisis. That's some important information in here, because The Guardian says the guide was commissioned by Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the House of Commons, who launched it with the shadow leader, Lucy Powell, amid concern about the impact of conspiracy theories, in many cases with anti-Semitic overtones. Well, a bit more detail on what this thing was about. Let's bring in a bit more text. The guide to inform members of Parliament, parliamentary candidates about the risks, and to try and draw out some of the key themes in order that you can be prepared to quickly assess and understand new conspiracy theories as they emerge. In this guide, we outline what conspiracy theories are their appeal and an oversight of 8 prominent conspiracies in the United Kingdom. And it goes on to say that conspiracy theories do not exist in isolation, but share and borrow core components. Numerous conspiracy theories are rooted in anti-Jewish racism. Key in this text, of course, is that the MPs are not bright enough to work out what is a conspiracy theory or not themselves. They should rely on this document by the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust. So our MPs, unfortunately, just not bright enough to work out what's true and what's not. But if we go on through, we start to see more information on Twitter. This is Matthew Sweet, who was tweeting out that it was it shows that there's something about the strangely touching faith that conspiracy theorists have in the power of institutions and the desire to see patterns that don't exist, which has so often end up with fantasies about secret Jewish power. Very, very quickly, the heavy pro-Jewish or conspiracy theories, which are being flagged up as being anti-Semitic. This is the meat of this document. So if we move on through, these are some of the organisations connected. We haven't got time in today's news to go into them in detail, but let's bring in the first one here, CST. Now, this organisation is almost like a private police force to protect the Jewish community, but it says that it's also screening them from racism and anti-Semitism, and ultimately it's working to promote and help the Jewish community at all times. So the minimum you can say is this is an extremely pro-Jewish organisation. Here's the Global Network on Extremism and Technology. And if we bring in some text here, we find that this is an academic research initiative backed by the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. So this is getting darker. This is operating worldwide, but apparently this organisation is helping to educate our MPs. Here's Tel Mama. Now this one is supposedly protecting the Islamic community from anti-Islam comments and racism. In the small print, it says Tel Mama is a national project of Faith Matters CIC, Community Interest Company. I'll bring the text in white so it's not hidden in the small print. But my question for the audience is a little prompt and just who is Faith Matters CIC? Because once we get investigating Faith Matters CIC, it becomes even more difficult to see who's behind them. So this guide for our politicians, which Penny Mordaunt has commissioned, very, very difficult to see who is really the power behind it in many areas. If we mention Full Fact, well, that's an easy one because just do your search on UK column and you can find that we've warned and warned about the duplicitous nature of this organisation over many years. One article, Full Fact equals Faux Fact, but have a look on UK column and you can see some of our concerns and warnings. But a big thank you to Mike Robinson, who was away speaking at the weekend about the clampdown on free speech. And he had mentioned the very Institute for Strategic Dialogue tied in with this anti-Semitism organisation. And here it is, powering solutions to extremism, hate and disinformation, mentioning Elon Musk. But it says it partners with government, cities, businesses and communities to deliver solutions at all levels, headquartered in London, with a global footprint of teams in Washington, Berlin, Amman, Nairobi, and Paris. So this isn't a small organisation. It's actually very powerful, but now it's advising British MPs. If we carry on through, it says that they're tracking online manipulation, disinformation, hate, and extremism in real time. So does this mean that we're all being watched now to see whether we dare to say something which could be construed as anti-Semitic? That's a very worrying situation. But it says that they're working to empower civil society, fostering networks of community influencers, and saying that we've trained over 32,000 activists and social influencers around the world. So I'm going to suggest this document that Penny Mordaunt has commissioned is nothing to do with protecting the Jewish community. This is about locking down on other members of the community and using these very powerful organizations to do so. So if we just come back to the document, there was one other name that caught my attention. Let's bring in a big, before we do, this is hidden when you look at the document, but there's a little bit of a subliminal. It says the earth is flat, which of course is to catch the eye of those politicians reading the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust document. But this was the other name that caught my eye, Aria Kovler. And when I went looking for him, we quickly come to Twitter, and he says, "Hey, that's my name on the cover. I was proud to contribute a chapter on global control conspiracy theories and the Great Reset to this guide." This is the gentleman concerned, very young, not sure what his expertise is, but he gets onto the World Economic Forum very quickly to say that this is one of the big targets of conspiracy theorists. He then mentions the Great Reset, but not to worry because this is just something that Prince Charles got involved in. So encourage viewers today to go and have a look at the Green King series on UK column, when Debbie Evans and myself have been warning about the real power that King Charles has and what work he's doing to enact this global reset. But just to stress the fact that the basis for this document is to protect people from anti-Semitism. It's extremely pro-Jewish. Here we've got a diagram they have where all of the key chapters of the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust document are linked back to anti-Semitism. And basically I'm saying that any critical analysis of policy, according to these people, is anti-Semitism. If we go to the conclusion, we don't need to spend long on this, but I'll encourage people to go through these particular areas. Basically, again, it comes down to the fact that MPs need this help to inform themselves and their constituents. But basically, it says that when people are presented with verified, reliable facts, they start to pay attention. Why is it then that when we challenge the government and global organizations for the verified, reliable facts, we're simply told to be quiet? So I'm going to end this segment by saying that in reality, this report is designed to stop busy MPs from thinking for themselves, and it's also designed to channel MPs into believing any criticism of government and global policy is conspiracy theory. And as such, that means that this document itself is disinformation and propaganda. A lot to be discussed there, Charles, but we'll save that for extra. I'm just going to play a little clip here of a video that was sent in to us. This is by a music band, and let's have a look at this, and then I'll explain what it's about, and we'll show the full video in extra time.
There are people out in the world right now that are drinking something called raw milk.
The top concern for the next 2 years is not conflict or climate. It is disinformation and misinformation.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the community use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Misinformation.
Well, there we are, a little taster from Raw Milk Conspiracy. If you want to see the full music video, join us for UK Column Extra Time. But we're going to poke a bit of fun back at the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust and what conspiracy is and is not. Well, let's move on to an area which is also of interest to many people concerned about real conspiracies, and that's Bilderberg. Welcome to today's news, Mark. What have you got for us?
Well, the main thing, gentlemen, is that
we pretty much know where Bilderberg's going to happen, and we got a pretty good jump on it. Normally, as we know, bilderbergmeetings.org, their official website, they don't want to release the information where and when until almost the last minute because they don't want conspiracy theorists, quote unquote, journalists hanging around, much less the so-called legacy media. But what we have here in this first slide is that Nya Tider, which is Swedish, that Swedish media outlet, had some communication with the government, and they evidently found out that Bilderberg will take place in Madrid, Spain, the 30th of May through June 2nd. So a pretty good jump compared to what Bilderberg meetings would be willing to do. Also shown in this slide, that first slide was the Nordic Times, also in Scandinavia. And moving on from there, the first American website to pick it up, American Free Press, Bilderberg, 2024 found in Spain. And there's a picture of the hotel. And it's the Eurostar Hotel, the Eurostar Hotel as it's known. Moving on from there, here we get into a little bit of the Swedish publication Nya Tider's angle that they got this from. As the first magazine in the world, I'm not sure what they mean by that. I'm reading from this slide here. Nya Tider discloses where and when 2024's Bilderberg meeting will take place. This publication has been in contact with the Swedish government office and invoked Sweden's constitutionally protected principle of public access to official records. That's doing better than the American government could ever do, and probably UK's as well, in order to be able to obtain documents regarding for this. Let's not go too fast on the one slide to another. Anyway, there's been correspondence, and Nya Tider was in touch with a secretary to a EU minister named Angela. Thanks for the call earlier. As I mentioned, it concerns the minister's availability to attend the Bilderberg meetings in Madrid on May 30 until June 2nd, et cetera, et cetera. Moving on from there. Anyway, the invitation to Bilderberg came from Sarah Nyman at Investor AB, the mighty Swedish business family Wallenberg's investment company. The email reveals a startling fact. Sarah Nyman, who invited the minister, the Swedish minister, in fact, has no position within the Bilderberg Group. Instead, she's employed at Investor AB as executive assistant to Marcus Wallenberg, which in practice means that she is the closest secretary to that Swedish business magnate. It is also from an email address at Investor AB that she contacts the Swedish Cabinet Committee. Moving from there, here's a little bit about Mr. Wallenberg himself, vice chairman at Investor AB, the Wallenberg Spheres investment company through which it owns large shares and thus gains decisive influence in large Swedish and international companies. For example, Investor AB is the largest shareholder in the bank SEB, where Marcus Wallenberg is chairman of the board of directors. He's also notably, of course, a member of the Bilderberg Group's exclusive steering committee, which is between 30 and 40 members, which is responsible for who comes and where they're going to meet, financing, what they're going to talk about. The fact that his secretary, Wallenberg's secretary, is now inviting the EU minister indicates that it's Mr. Wallenberg who's really in charge of which Swedish ministers come. That's the Nya Tider's outlook or opinion on what's happening. In her reply to Sarah Nyman, the secretary at the Swedish government's cabinet committee, Angela Kennedy, responds that the EU minister Roswell will not be able to participate. Which ministers will participate is thus still unknown to the public in terms of Swedish ministers. Anyway, the Bilderberg Group's well-known strategy, as I mentioned earlier, is to wait until the very end to make the meeting and its participants public, with the aim of making media scrutiny more difficult. Information before or after the meeting is also not made public by any governments, claiming that whoever attends the meetings does so as a private person. That ties into the Chatham House rule. We'll go from there. Nya Tider was the only Swedish newspaper, they're claiming, to reveal, and this is interesting, that the government's NATO negotiator, Sweden's NATO negotiator, Oskar Stenström, attended the Bilderberg meeting last year in Lisbon, Portugal. And here's the notable part. His presence was secret. He was not on the official list of participants, guys. Shortly after the meeting, he resigned from his position, we're told, at the Swedish government office and was instead then employed by Marcus Wallenberg himself. So this is one example, guys, that we've heard of over the years. When I would cover Bilderberg with Jim Tucker at AFP in years past, that there were always assumed to be people there that were not on the official list released by the official website, bilderbergmeetings.org. And that's one example. There have been others. In this last slide, we have kind of an interesting twist, and that is at Wikispooks, there is, we'll call it a conspiracy theory. I'm being a little bit tongue-in-cheek here. There's information reasonably convincing that Bilderbergers, as I'm sharing here, have taken part, in pandemic planning exercises. That is, people that have attended Bilderberg over the years, they're saying have been instrumental in COVID pandemic exercises, and many were active in early 2020, promoting fear and doubt and setting the scene for the COVID event, controlling the narrative to promote the fear of the novel deadly virus in May 2020. And at least 14 people who have attended Bilderberg, this alleges, signed something called the United Behind a People's Vaccine Against COVID-19, which is being called a call to create an infrastructure capable of rapidly injecting everyone in the world with the COVID jabs, which they correctly predicted would appear. They being people who have attended Bilderberg fairly frequently, they populated COVID task forces and locked the world down and uncritically pushed these vaxes to the point of announcing mandates. So that Wikispooks link, which I shared, viewers can look at that later and decide for themselves. But it's a very intriguing and compelling post there at Wikispooks, and it's a lot of food for thought. But anyway, there's more to share on the other Bilderberg later in the show that's very intriguing. And that's it for now, guys. So it looks like the jig is up, and it looks like we know where they're meeting.
Mark, thank you very much for that. Well, of course, in my head, we know that they're unbelievably secretive, and there's only one reason that you hold meetings in secret, and that's to deny people information. And the fact that you are reporting and we are reporting on this, according to the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust, means that we're automatically into a conspiracy. No, we want the truth about what's actually happening inside these meetings. So we'll continue to ask questions. Thank you very much for the report. Now, I'm very pleased to say that Diane Rasmussen McAdie has been able to join us. Diane, can you hear me?
Yes, Brian, it's great to be here. And it appears as though they're doing a fire alarm test in the library at the exact time that I'm on the air. So apologies for that. Yes, I just came from STV, the situation on the Finetti case. I'm not sure if you'd like to say a little bit more about that, or if you'd like to show the video that I brought.
Diane, I think what we should do is I've got a little clip from the video that you kindly pointed us to. So let's have a listen to that. It's Mr. Swinney himself talking about the Finetti case. Let's watch that, and then we'll bring you back on screen.
So all of those questions will be explored as part of the process of proper consideration of the issues that are raised by the Finetti women.
So are you holding out some hope for them that they could be included?
But the Parliament legislated for a particular scheme, which has got eligibility criteria.
And as it stands, they say it excludes them. They've been at the Petitions Committee in the Parliament, and they say that it excludes them.
These issues will be explored. We'll engage with the Petitions Committee. The Petitions Committee has put its points to the government, and they will be considered.
So when Julia Robinson was there, she refused to do that. She said that there was no further consideration.
Well, we'll look at all of that evidence to see if there is.
So you will look again afresh.
Well, we're looking at that to determine whether there is any opportunity to pursue the issues that are raised by the individuals that are concerned. But what I would maintain is that Parliament has taken decisions already to establish a scheme on that basis, and that's what will be considered.
But can you give them any hope today as First Minister?
What I'm setting out is that we have an approach to redress which is being followed assiduously within the scheme. I am pleased that there are individuals who are being supported as a consequence of that scheme, and the government will of course engage with individuals who seek eligibility to that scheme.
I'll just say it's possible that the audio was a little bit low on that. What Mr. Swinney was saying, he was being challenged about would the Fenethy ladies be allowed to take part in the Scottish redress system. He was saying there are a number of checks and balances, but essentially I was picking up that he was indicating that they would be able to come forward and to make application. But Diane, you've done the interview with Scottish TV this morning. What's your take on Mr. Swinney and what he was saying?
Well, I was there, Brian, with 4 of the Fenethy survivors who were interviewed as well. And they showed us that clip and then asked us for our reactions to the clip. The reaction from the women, first of all, is that they were angry. They felt like they were getting nowhere. Once again, I feel like even though John Swinney likes to take responsibility for setting up the criteria on the redress scheme when he was Deputy First Minister, he doesn't understand his own criteria. And I say that because the problem is that if you read the criteria, and this is part of the evidence that I had submitted in support of the petition from the Fenethy survivors to the government, is that it specifically excludes them because of phrases like short-term care, things like holiday home, things like respite facility. We know that holiday home, respite facility, convalescent are not accurate under the way it was set up under Glasgow Education Corporation, that it was a residential school. I have made that point over and over again. It wasn't like the parents dropped them off the holiday. So the key issue is whether or not they are considered in loco parentis in care of the state, which I was able to establish they are through the various acts and bills and legislation and structures that were in place at the time. But what John Swinney said back in January 2023, and I quote, I do not think that there is an inherent impediment to applications coming forward and being considered. To put it slightly more bluntly, I reject the idea that the scheme is not for Fenethy survivors. I think that it is possible for Fenethy survivors to be successful in applying under the scheme. So my concern is that he doesn't understand his own criteria, and he seems to be backpedaling just a bit from what he was saying back in January of 2023, Brian.
I'm very sad to hear that, Diane. I must say, when I listened to that clip this morning, I was thinking, this is an interesting statement. This may be a difficult question for you, but what about Scottish TV, a major media channel north of the border? Do they seem to understand the importance of getting the Fenethy women into the redress system?
They do. And I will say, first of all, that my allegiance is live with UK Colin, and I was only on TV because I was asked to be there. But Colin McAdie is the reporter who's been following it. But one of the problems that they've had in recent times is they have invited Scottish TV to cover the last couple of meetings that we've had with the Petitions Committee. However, the last minute, the reporters have pulled out saying there was no camera person available, or they can't make it, somebody's unwell. But Colin actually got them in today because this was his first interview with John Swinney as First Minister that he had last week. And he specifically asked about Fenethy because he's been following the case very carefully. I would say that Colin McAdie realizes that Shona Robinson's performance in the committee 2 months ago when we were there was terrible, and he felt like John Swinney's reply was slightly better. But I also don't see the strength that we saw in him when he was in Deputy First Minister. I'm wondering if the pressure is on him a bit now that he is the boss and he has to make a decision one way or the other what to do with potentially thousands of abused women that went to Fenethy.
Diane, very good point. We could just say, is he the boss? And are there other people behind the scenes who are powerful enough to pull strings on Mr. Swinney himself? Who knows? But we'll watch this with interest. I'm going to say thank you very much for the report. And of course, we will stay supporting the Fenethy women and doing everything we can. And I know that you're busy with more research into the archives. So thank you very much for joining us, and we will have you back again. Well, where does that take us? It takes us on to UK Column itself, and we say to our audience, if you're watching us wherever you are, UK or overseas, please do join us and support us and take out a monthly subscription, because we can only do what we do with your financial support, and we are very grateful to the people who support us on a monthly basis, because you've enabled us to be what we are. We would like to expand and cover more, as many people are asking us to cover more subjects. The information we put out is there to be shared. Please do mention UK Column when that material goes out. And we'll just say that if you haven't made a purchase from UK Column shop, go online and have a look at the shop to see whether there's something that attracts you, because all of this helps us. Now, tomorrow at 1 p.m, we've got Alex Thompson's interview with Yuri Roska. He was a Moldovan politician who served as Deputy Prime Minister of Moldova in 2009. And I'm sure this will be an extremely interesting interview with him and Alex Thompson. So tune in at 1 o'clock tomorrow for that. And the next one I can call on screen is a UK Column event, Sunday, May the 19th at 1 o'clock to 3 p.m. And that's from national security to biosecurity, global power dynamics and the erosion of freedom in the 21st century. And this is a symposium in honour of the late Graham McQueen, author of the 2001 Anthrax Deception, the Case for a Domestic Conspiracy. Oh my goodness, there's that word again. And we've got Madhava Sethi, MD, and Meryl Nass, MD, both of whom have made comments, common challenges facing freedom movements, observations from an engineer and anesthesiologist, if I pronounce that one correctly. That's Madhava Sethi, and biowarfare, biosecurity, and the WHO pandemic preparedness agenda is Meryl Nass. So do tune in to see that. Okay, well, where does that take us? I think this brings us back to you, Charles, and you're on the subject of water.
Indeed, water. We've spoken a lot about food and the probable scarcity of it towards the end of this year on various UK Column broadcasts recently. We've not spoken too much about water, but we start with a publication or an announcement from the OEP, the Office for Environmental Protection, which appears to be rather mundane in that it concerns regulations, but they say that they find it deeply concerning that there are issues with how the laws in place to protect England's rivers, lakes and coastal waters are being put into practice. This comes from a recent review of implementation of the Water Framework Directive, regulations and river basin management planning in England. Now, I would caution against taking this at face value, but I will nonetheless read from the executive summary. They say that the government is not on track to meet the environmental objectives it has set under the regulations, where they're concerned about the environmental objectives with a 2027 deadline, so there's a sense of urgency there. The measures in place and planned and the funds committed are not yet close to being enough to meet these outcomes for most water bodies. Without significant additional action and resources applied with pace and ambition, they appear likely to be missed by a large margin. So we've got that on the one hand, talking about the regulatory side of things, but what it encourages us to do is have a look at what DEFRA have to say about their plan for water for the United Kingdom, and in particular, the integrated plan for delivering clean and plentiful water. But what is it in actual fact that they do look at? Chapter 2 here, delivering a clean water environment for people and nature. And this is now chiming very much with policy on food, land, and indeed woodland. But they talk about being in a naturally and healthy and naturally functioning state. Rivers, streams, ponds, lakes, wetlands, estuaries, and coasts deliver multiple benefits for society. Indeed, but how? These benefits include flood risk management, carbon sequestration, clean water, and drought resilience. Access to blue spaces can also boost health and well-being. Restoring our water habits will mean that people and wildlife can still benefit from these ecosystems for generations to come. That may well be the case, but how exactly are they going to benefit and under what conditions? So we'll look a bit further into water policy, or what's been going on recently, and believe it or not, I don't know what the weather's like with you today, but here it's bucketing down, as Brian said. We've got the National Drought Group meeting after a record wet October to March. And apart from the sort of incongruous nature of that headline, we will actually look at what they say, because it is very significant. By 2050, we may need nearly 5 billion additional litres of water per day to meet the demand for public water supply. So we look back or think back to the pace and ambition that the OEP were talking about. And that leads us to something that Debbie was talking about on Friday, previous Friday, the 3rd of May. And it's the World Economic Forum Global Water Initiative. And specifically the Champions for Water Innovation, within which they talk about supporting a range of collaborations to identify and scale up a new generation of public-private collaborations that can accelerate implementation of Sustainable Development Goal 6, the dedicated goal on water and sanitation. And they conclude by talking about re-energizing and reframing the global dialogue on water security. So it was Joan, hang on, I've forgotten her name, Joan Vino, I think, Vion, who Debbie cited as really picking into this idea of the public-private partnership. And in effect, this is exactly where we see the direction of travel in the UK. And of course, the other thing to bear in mind is the utter failure to address the increase in population over the last 40 years, with the failure to have built any more reservoirs. We've got Havant Thicket Reservoir, which I have spoken about before, and just to remind you that although they're casting it as being a freshwater drinking supply, in actual fact, a significant proportion of the water that goes into it for drinking will in fact be recycled. They say it's going to be ready by 2029. Is that the case? Anglian Water, talking about a bold new vision on the Fens. Yorkshire Water, 8.5 million given to a service reservoir project underway. So there are things happening. Now, perhaps on a slightly more trivial, or at least apparently trivial basis, there is a press release today from DEFRA talking about the number of new bathing sites getting the go-ahead. And the reason I would posit that this is significant is that it talks about reforming the bathing water regulations, and in particular increasing the monitoring, and they talk a lot about monitoring outside of the bathing water season and preventing automatic de-designation of existing bathing water sites. Of course, the point being that once you have designated a bathing site, then you have control over it. And it's exactly what we're seeing with the production of food. It's all to do with the control of the particular piece of land. And when we think about this in terms of the Sustainable Markets Initiative and the Terracotta 30 by 30, and this push to be effectively controlling spaces in order that access to those may be perhaps restricted in future by for the public. The other thing, of course, that control of bathing sites gifts is the ability for the government to be able to dangle the spectre of fear from a public health concern. And we see here a headline from the Telegraph talking about the possibility of polluted water. And on the public-private partnership side of it, New Civil Engineer reporting about the Environment Agency appointing a consultant for a £70 million contract for mapping climate event data. And we just finish off here with JBA Consulting tweeting out that they're excited to be part of this appointment for the mapping and modelling framework. So, as I say, the point here is the ability of these bodies that are able to control water, the use of water, and indeed to effectively, exactly as Joan Vion was talking about, to take assets that are really public assets that are initially controlled by the state and hand them over to corporations for all sorts of gains that would not be to the public advantage.
And no conspiracy there. Absolute fact in what you're reporting, Charles, which is an important thing, I think, to stress today. Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, where does that bring us? I think that's back on to Mark Anderson, who's going to bring us up to date with the latest from the World Health Organization, another organization seeking control.
What's important, gentlemen and listeners in UK column land, is that the May 10 deadline was reached. Governments agree in this WHO press release I'm reading from, governments agree to continue their steady progress on proposed pandemic agreement ahead of the World Health Assembly. And it's dated May 10th, and that was the last official day of the intergovernmental negotiating body that was created a couple years ago or so to negotiate this treaty. And the treaty is now being called a treaty most of the time by the World Health Organization. I need that previous slide up still with the headline, if I may. Anyway, just a little bit of this. Governments of the world today agreed to continue working on a proposed pandemic agreement. They use the word agreement and treaty interchangeably, and to further refine the draft ahead of the 77th World Health Assembly that starts May 27 and ends June 2nd. almost in line with Bilderberg, which is May 30 through June 2nd. Governments meeting at the WHO headquarters in Geneva agreed to resume hybrid and in-person discussion over the coming weeks to advance work on critical issues, including around a proposed new global system for pathogen access and benefit sharing, that is, life-saving vaccines, quote unquote, treatments and diagnostic, pandemic prevention, and of course, the One Health philosophy, which looks at humans and animals and plant life on the same level and same value judgments, and the financial coordination that's needed. So what it means, though, is the INB stopped their official negotiating on May 10th, as promised, and now they're really just going to resume at the World Health Assembly itself, as is being indicated, at least by all indications. Now, there's a couple of quick quotes in this brief report. This is from a May 3rd press conference that I covered. This is Precious Metsoso, as she's known, a WHO apparatchik. She said this: the adoption of a treaty is not the end of a process. It is a beginning. Once the World Health Assembly adopts this pandemic agreement, then it kickstarts other processes, firstly at a country level. And there's one other quote from her. There must be ratification, she says, by parliaments, and we have to get a threshold of countries that ratifies the treaty so that it can come into force. So she's basically saying that parliaments, which would include Congress on our side of the pond, will have a stab at this. The noted WHO watchdog James Roguski, jamesroguski.substack.com, he has some doubts about the veracity of that. He thinks they're being a little disingenuous and just telling people what they want to hear, and that they'll take a largely executive approach to this and not let the elected people in parliaments and Congress have much, if any, say. I guess that remains to be seen. The U.S. Senate rules on treaties does provide for the constitutionally required advice and consent by the Senate, where 2/3, a supermajority of the 100 senators, have to vote yes or no on a given thing like this treaty. However, in the Senate rules, it does provide for an alternative that would be largely, if not totally, an executive decision where the president would make the call and the Senate would be cut out of the equation. So the involvement of our elected reps, guys, kind of remains to be seen. The other thing is that there's a statement in Article 35 of the draft treaty that I find very ambiguous and hard to understand. But at the press conference I covered May 3rd, where these photos came from that I took, they said that 60 nations would have to adopt the treaty for it to come into force. The only thing that I'm not clear on is, would it be 60 and then it would go to the parliaments? Or would 60 countries through their parliaments have to vote on this to make it come into force? Which way would it be? So I'm trying to unravel that. And next week, I hope to have that completely ironed out as to exactly how this would come into force if it does. And there's still some language being used. I'll end with this, where they're still kind of suggesting that they're not quite as far along on this thing as they'd like people to believe. So it's possible they'll get past the World Health Assembly without adopting this treaty, which would buy a lot of time for those that are against it. And so much remains to be seen, but that's the latest news.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. Well, that one seems to me to be another power grab by the World Health Organization. Meanwhile, we're still trying to deal with what took place around COVID itself. And I just want to say a very big thank you to people north of the border who gave me a little bit of a prompt to cover some of the material about the Scottish COVID inquiry. And I've got a short section here, but we hope to have more in the coming UK column news edition. So this is BBC News here with a report, Scottish COVID inquiry, public asked to share experiences of pandemic. But when you get into the text, it says that the Scottish Government will, the inquiry will take place from the 1st of January 2020 to the end of 2022. It's investigating pre-pandemic planning, the decision to go into lockdown, supply and distribution of personal protective equipment, and how the virus was dealt with in care homes. It will establish facts and lessons learned. So nobody is going to be brought to book for this. It's all lessons learned. Let's just have a look at a very short clip showing how this inquiry is conducted, and a young lady speaking about how she was adversely affected during the COVID-19 period.
Now, good morning, Miss Barami.
Good morning, my lord. Our next witness is Kate Stott, and her witness statement reference for the record is SCI WT 0397-501.
Good morning, Miss Stott.
Good morning.
Right, Miss Barami's got some questions for you, and we'll just start when she's ready.
Thank you, my lord. Good morning, Miss Stott.
Good morning.
So starting with your background briefly, you had a few health issues as a child which resolved by adulthood. And as an adult, you began experiencing Crohn's disease, and alongside that, you have annual bouts of strep throat, alongside reactive arthritis and weakness in your legs. Is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
I would just say it's tragic what people experience during the COVID-19 period. And I think it's interesting how few people there are in that room, Charles. When I look at it, we've got a TV screen, and a man who's not even present, he's on a TV screen. 1 or 2 people in the room, but so many people adversely affected. So I found that very sad. If you want to see more information on, sorry, just pop back here. If you want to see more reliable information on what actually took place with COVID-19 north of the border, there's a very good Substack here, the Biology Phenom Substack. And I was kindly sent a couple of reports by Moira Dundee. So we've got Scottish COVID-19 Inquiry Impact Hearing, Health and Social Care. And there are a number of people who spoke out about really tragic events around what happened to family members and loved ones. I've got another one here. Highlights from this session include Miss Lorraine Mackenzie, representing PAMIS, speaking of the harms from lockdown restrictions on her disabled son, David. So if you want to go to this particular Substack, I'm told that the information there is extremely good. This is another one where a lady lost her brother. I think he was just 41. And she says the doctors were lying to me on a daily basis. Nurses were lying to me on a daily basis. Everything that was in my brother's notes was different to what I was being told on a daily basis. And inset on screen, we've got a Freedom of Information response in Scotland, where the authorities have been asked to tell the total amount of deaths where COVID-19 was noted as the sole cause of death on a death certificate within all hospitals in NHS Tayside from 2020 to 2023. And if you look at the responses, if it's 80 plus years old, which would be extremely vulnerable, in the top section, we've just got 5, then 7, then less than 5 and less than 5. So these are very small numbers of the people that we were all being told were unbelievably vulnerable. And then I'd like to just add to this short report that Moira Dundee, who UK Column knows as a very gutsy woman, and you can listen to my audio interview with Moira if you go to the UK Column website. She told me yesterday that when activists, including herself, tried and failed to hand in witness statements to the police, which included evidence of forged signatures, a police sergeant said, "I should not be taking on an investigation myself. This would go to a national COVID inquiry." The police know, we all know, COVID inquiries have no law enforcement powers, which I mentioned. They're simply there, they say, to find facts and report lessons learned. But Moira goes on to say, by refusing to accept evidence complaints against NHS doctors, Police Scotland is showing blatant selective law enforcement. Doctors are clearly being protected. And she then says this begs the question, if it's not a police matter, NHS doctors describing drugs which hasten death and forging patient signatures, Why did the police investigate Dr. Harold Shipman? Either all doctors ought to be investigated when suspicion arises, or no doctors investigated. Harold Shipman was regarded as practicing excellent medicine by his colleagues. A doctor told a disciplinary hearing today, and that was as reported by The Guardian. So I'm going to say a big thank you to Maura Dundee for that little report. UK column will do more on what's been happening north of the border in due course, but do have a look at that Substack. And where does that bring us? Back to yourself, I think, is it?
It does, and to space, which you may or may not have detected, has received an awful lot of sort of press coverage, government announcements. There's great sort of generation of enthusiasm about all things concerning space. And the somewhat surprising headline from Vatican News just last week that the head of NASA, Bill Nelson, on the Vatican Observatory's work to explore the heavens, and this is reinforced by the NASA website itself. He's off to Italy, Vatican, and Saudi Arabia. And here we are. We see the Vatican Observatory website talking about faith-inspiring science, which might ask one or two questions about the beliefs of the Catholic Church. We won't get bogged down in that. But however, what it does seem to obscure and obfuscate is what's been happening at the United Nations. And on the 24th of April, the announcement that the Security Council failed to adopt a first ever resolution on arms race in outer space due to negative vote by Russian Federation. So, of course, the UN, presumably supposed to be impartial in these matters, very much blaming Russia. But what they do at least have the grace to do is report what the Russian representative said, which is that the council is involved in a dirty spectacle prepared by the US and Japan. He described it as a cynical ploy. We are being tricked. And critically here, he recalls that the ban on placing weapons of mass destruction in outer space is already enshrined in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. And he said that in Washington and Tokyo and their allies are cherry-picking weapons of mass destruction out of all other weapons, trying to camouflage their lack of interest in outer space being free from any kinds of weapons. So in effect, what is this all about, and what were the US and Japan up to, and how does that bear relation to what the United Kingdom has to say about this? Well, really, it concerns what might be described as the militarization of space, upon which there was a House of Commons briefing paper put out in 2021. And within that, there is the statement, of course, that in the last few years, there's been considerable investment by several states, most notably Russia and China, in offensive counter-space capabilities that potentially threaten the use of space by UK and its allies. The US has responded by calling for a rapid increase in the development of counter-space capability and the adoption of more aggressive politics and postures. So for context, let's look at the graph they produce here, which shows at the top the absolutely overwhelming majority of space capabilities going to the United States. And in particular, on the right, the lighter green colour, government or military. China, again, has a similar amount of government or military, but those two dwarf absolutely all the other nations, of course, including Russia, which is always blamed for everything at the moment. The United Kingdom, it's worth noting, has predominantly commercial satellites. But why is this relevant now? It's because that man, Elon Musk, who seems to be able to do absolutely everything all the time, is, of course, running his SpaceX projects, and in particular, the Starshield, which is described as being available or designed for consumer and commercial use, but it's also designed for government use with an initial focus on three areas, which are Earth observation, communications, and hosted payloads. Well, now, what exactly does that mean? Here we go. Starshield, described as supporting national security, but of course, Starshield is based on the Starlink capability, which ironically, when I took this screenshot, told us that it's currently experiencing degraded service. But nonetheless, it has high-speed internet around the world, or at least not quite. And when we consider the implications or ramifications of this and in effect, the privatization of war, this here's Starlink, and I've titled this Enabling the Right Kind of War, because, of course, Starlink is not made available to either Russia, China, Belarus, Afghanistan, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, or Iran. So we're presented with a situation in which we see this, as described by the House of Commons, militarization of space, but certainly not a level playing field, and indeed one in which even the United Nations is beginning to meddle and exhibit a significant amount of partisanship. So To pardon the terrible pun, we will be watching this space.
Thank you for that. Now we're coming close to the end of today's news, but Mark, just take us through the other Bilderberg.
I can be brief. There's no reason to be too windy here. The other Bilderberg always takes place in Idaho at Sun Valley Resort, a stunningly posh resort in southern central Idaho. And here from Fortune, we have a headline: inside the yearly summer camp for billionaires for Silicon Valley execs and media bigwigs, hosted by one of Wall Street's most exclusive and, I might say, elusive firms. Going on from there very briefly, what we know about the ultra-private Sun Valley Conference host, the 2023, all we have information on is last year. We don't have 2024 yet. The 2023 Allen & Company Sun Valley Conference, dubbed the annual summer camp for billionaires, kicked off in the mountain resort of Sun Valley, Idaho, in exactly 2 weeks ahead of when this was written. So basically, it'll take place in mid-July in Idaho, and I'll have more on it later. Only a handful of photographers are allowed to attend. The media cannot be there, except I'll mention now, we'll skip this slide about the history of Allen & Company. We'll come back to that later, but they do have offices in New York City and London. I'll mention that. And Allen & Company is one of the most secretive financial firms I've come across, and they're the organizers of this conference. The important slide is the next one, and then we can wind up. And no, the one after that, I'm sorry. This one here, the firm, Allen & Company, is behind a number of significant deals, and these deals, according to the Observer, were largely either seeded or started or consummated at these annual conferences, which have been going on since about 1982 or so in Idaho. Disney's merger with ABC in 1996, Google's initial public offering in 2004, the $18 billion merger between Activision and Vivendi Games 2011, Twitter's IPO 2013, Jeff Bezos' purchase of the Washington Post, which is basically the CIA's own newspaper, tied to Bilderberg's founding, I might add, 2013, and Facebook's $19 billion purchase of WhatsApp in 2014. And I'll conclude, guys, by noting that Nya Tider, the Swedish publication that earlier in this broadcast I talked about breaking the fact that Bilderberg's evidently going to meet in Spain this year in Madrid, they also had another report that said the Sun Valley Conference actually involves intelligence officials and news and entertainment moguls, and that they supposedly plot out how the news will actually be carried out, how the news will be composed in conjunction with the government. Now, that's a bit out there, maybe in some people's eyes, but that's what Nya Tider was claiming. At the very least, media is much more of a focus at this Bilderberg than the other Bilderberg. This one in Idaho is mostly media and big tech. The one in that's been meeting since 1954, the original Bilderberg, is of course much broader, with Treasury officials and NATO and royalty and things like that. So there'll be much more of this between now and mid-July, of course. So, but the other Bilderberg has emerged, and who knew, right?
Who knew? Mark, thank you very much indeed for that. And I'll just say to our audience, here we are asking questions about what these immensely powerful global corporations are up to, what they're doing in secret meetings behind closed doors. It's utterly outrageous that when we do this, we should have organizations like the Anti-Semitism Policy Trust accusing us and many other good people of being conspiracy theorists. It's truly outrageous. We'll end there. Big thank you to our audience for joining us. Diane, I can still see you on screen. Are you able to join us for Extra?
I'd be delighted to, Brian. Thank you.
Okay, that's really good. So we will have Diane, Rasmussen, McAdie with us for Extra as well. We can discuss a little bit of the Finethi ladies, but for our monthly subscribers, please join us in a few minutes for UK Column Extra. That's it for today. Thank you for joining me, Charles. It's been
not at all.
Really
and just to clarify the timings for the symposium on Sunday will be from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock British Summer Time.
Yes, we said as if it was UK time. Yeah. So in fact, It's 6 to 8 in UK time. Thank you for the reminder. We'll end there. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.